Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone, to the August 5th edition of Friday Office Hour. For those of you that are tuning in from Twitter, I can't see you in the studio. And for those of you that would like to join in and interact in the chat, feel free to hop on over to the YouTube platform. That's where I will be able to see your comments in real time. And just as a disclaimer, you can remain relatively anonymous in this live stream unless your real name is in your YouTube username. All right, so welcome everyone to Under the Hood Friday Office Hour. This is a fairly new online community where aspiring current or retired STEM students and professionals can get together and talk about the behind the scenes experiences of the people you care about who have dedicated their lives to careers in STEM. So, a couple other disclaimers. If you have questions that you'd like to put in the Google form, please do so, and I will respond to those at the current or next office hour. Also, please don't put any questions related to Title IX in this form, or I'd rather not discuss Title IX issues on this platform. Please reach out to your qualified representative at your institution when it comes to Title IX issues. The views expressed on this live do not reflect those of my institution or both past and present. Alrighty. So today we will be talking about budgets, okay? Specifically external funding and budgets that align with external sponsors, okay? So this live is dedicated to super or just early career principal investigators, or even graduate students and postdocs who are putting together fellowship budgets. This could be applicable. And thirdly, for those of you who are not a principal investigator yet, but you may be able to get PI status by exception through your institution. So if you are a staff member or you're a postdoc who isn't really sure if you can submit proposals as a principal investigator, contact your research unit head and see if you can get PI by exception status, which will allow you to put your name on a proposal as PI. Okay. The next thing I want to do is give a shout out to Miss Nia Jones. Hey, Nia. She inspired this live through some pretty interesting questions in regard to the way research operations take place at the university level. So thanks, Nia. All right, let's get started. Okay, so the purpose of a budget is fairly self-explanatory, but just to set the pace and the stage for today, your budget means or is formulated to distribute the funding that will be associated with an award if you are awarded that grant. So budgets are put in place for pretty much all RFPs or requests for proposals, and I'll discuss that definition in just a minute. So for those of you that get a knot in your stomach when you start to think about money and funding, you got to get over that in research. You probably want to learn how to use Excel if you don't know. It's a pretty decent tool for building budgets. I've come to the knowledge that Excel and Microsoft Suite are no longer taught in school. So they were when I was in school. And some of my students don't use Excel these days. So most budgets are formulated in Excel in major research institutions. So get comfortable with that, get comfortable with formulas. Budgets constrain the scope and scale of your project. I want to spend a little time on this bullet. So when you're responding to a call for proposals, usually you have a maximum that you can allot per year of the project period. And it is an undesirable thing to think about, but your science is usually constrained by external budgets or funding from external sponsors. So you may have to scale back on the amount of research you want to do, the number of people you plan to engage with, if it's a community-facing project, the number of trials that you have set forth, if it's a clinical trial, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll talk about how you can evaluate scope and scale when you're making your budget in just a second. The third bullet says budgets allow you to evaluate the feasibility of the project that you're proposing. Okay. So once again, it's not cool to set numerical bounds on your science, but if you aren't able to carry out the research that you have planned within the budget that is allotted to you, then the project is not feasible. If there isn't funding for it, then it's simply not feasible. You have to keep that in mind. All right. I just want to also say right now, and I may talk about that later, I think I am going to talk about that in a slide coming up. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about are RFPs, RFAs, which are requests for proposals or requests for applications. It's the same thing. These are documents that are published by funding sponsors to indicate that there is an opportunity for eligible organizations to submit proposals, submit applications to be externally evaluated and then awarded to your institution. The RFPs will constrain the scope and scale of your project. Once again, they will tell you what your maximum funding limit is. They'll also tell you what type of research that they may or may not be considering for that call. So, like NIH will indicate whether or not which is the National Institutes of Health, they will indicate whether or not clinical trials are supported in their calls. If it is a strictly science-related proposal, such as something coming through NASA, the Department of Energy, or NSF, they will let you know that health-related applications are not a part of the scope of the call for proposals. So please reference episode 3 with Mitch Boritz, who talks about interpreting RFPs. Read the RFPs really carefully, and hopefully there is support at your institution to help you interpret those RFAs, especially if it's your first time submitting a proposal, and the RFPs can actually be pretty overwhelming to read. Some of them can be in excess of 50 pages. So you probably don't know what to prioritize, what's important, what language is flexible, what's a hard yes, what's a hard no, and how to interpret those RFPs. All right. Okay. So the other thing that I want to talk about here is go through an example of how you can interpret an RFP in the language around the budget. I took a really current example of a NASA Roses call A49, an Earth Science Application Equity and Environmental Justice call. And so this is a snapshot from the actual call for applications. This opportunity has since been closed, and I think they've already given out the notices of award. So if you look here, this is the summary of key information, which is found on like page 20 or something. It's way deep down in the RFP. So for instance, this call for fiscal year 2022 to 2023, meaning that's when the funds are going to be dispersed, is expecting to disperse around $3 million. All right. That doesn't mean that one grant will be awarded $3 million. That's the total program budget. Anticipated number of awards, 15 to 25. So they're already telling us the distribution of awards. And this pretty much tells you what your odds are. Okay. You can, if they're looking to award 15 to 25 proposals, and if you're familiar with NASA, you kind of understand how many proposals get submitted for these calls, and you can gauge what the competition will be like based on who is in your space. So I obviously was not a part of the review panel, but if I had to guess, they may have gotten up to 50 to 75 proposals for this call. Meaning the odds or the likelihood of getting a proposal is 15 out of 50 or 25 out of 75, which is a good 30% success rate, which is pretty good. NSF has a success rate of about 5 to 10%. Okay, so NASA generally has pretty good funding rates for their calls. Maximum duration of award, this is important. And for this call, it's 6 to 24 months. So you will create your budget accordingly. And usually we create budgets by year. So for this budget, whether you're doing it for 6 months, which will be a 1-year budget, or 24 months, which is a 2-year budget, you still have to formulate your budget in terms of years. This is the funding breakdown per award type. There's 3 types of awards, and the scope of each type is actually provided in the rest of the RFP. And this is where you set your budget cap. This is a strict cap. This is not the situation where you want to be like, oh, my idea is worth the extra $50K. I'm going to submit it, and hopefully the program manager will see how awesome my idea is. No, they're just going to see that you don't follow directions. So take the cap seriously. Also, your pre-award coordinator will flag this if you have one. So if you're working at an institution that has a research support office, they will flag it as over budget and they won't let you submit. But if you're working on a budget on your own at an institution that doesn't have that type of internal support, don't go over the maximum. Also, for those that are kind of maybe not as experienced with budgets, try to allocate the same amount per year. It's just easier to do. For those of us that have consumables or we have to make heavy equipment purchases in year one, your year one budget will be up front loaded with more costs. And then your year 2 and 3 budget will be less. And that's okay. It's okay to have a different budget amount per year. All right. And so that's pretty much the budget information that's important in the summary of key information. Okay. So let us move on. Alrighty, I'm going to quickly go through the budget categories that exist in most budgets, right? These categories are fairly standard for the National Science Foundation, right? And I've found that these categories are consistently present for other sponsors as well. But you can think of these as your standard NSF budget categories. So let's go through these. Salary, all right? Most tenure track professors can budget salary on their grants, and the amount of salary that a PI or a faculty member can budget is dependent on their discipline. Okay. So, for instance, public health faculty usually have to support a greater percentage of their 12-month salary than, say, engineering. So, me in particular, I have a 9-month salary, meaning the institution covers 9 months of what I am eligible to earn per year, and I can supplement that salary with external grants. I also want to make a caveat here that we are talking about external funding, and startup budgets I talk about in one of the faculty position series. So be sure to check that out. So also with salary, you can support graduate students' salary for a year, up to a year. You can support postdoctoral salary. You can support research staff, lab manager salary, any personnel that will be associated with your project. Even undergraduates can draw salary from an external award. Benefits are going to be the health insurance, tuition for graduate students, and fees. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what goes into benefits in just a minute, but this is going to be the costs associated with also the retirement contribution. Well, I don't want to say retirements, but the overall benefit rate for the personnel associated with the project. Equipment, all right. So equipment is a distinct category, and we're talking about items that have a unit price of $5,000 or more. So one of the things will have to cost $5,000 or more for it to be categorized as equipment. Okay. Even if you have laboratory equipment that you use for your research operations, if it's $3,000, it's considered supply in your budget. So let's go to supplies and expenses. This is the catch-all for anything else that's budgeted in an external grant. Participant costs go under supplies, and these are going to be your stipends associated with community participants or RU participants. That's a research experience for undergraduate, stipends for research experiences for teachers, and that kind of thing. And those get directly paid without any benefit rate to the participants. Contractors fall under this budget category. And there are specific rules on how the contractor amount how it's set. So be careful about the contractor category, because there is language at each institution and even with the sponsor about how to set the rate for a contractor. There may have to be some external bidding process, and you may have to provide justification as to why this certain amount and why this proposed contractor is being used for the project. Category, because I'm least familiar with the rules associated with that. Computers, so laptops, desktops will fall under supplies and expenses. For those of us that are doing computational research, you can put your fees for space or computational space on a supercomputing cluster here. But if you have your own, or you're building your own computational cluster, and each unit or each node has a cost greater than $5,000, that needs to go into equipment. Facilities fees. All right. So not everyone will have a facilities fee. I used to work at a place that had these, and sometimes they are billed as direct costs. And this can be upwards of 25% of your direct cost. And that's in addition to indirect costs. Okay. So this may be the fees associated with you renting time to use shared machinery, etc. And then other supplies. Travel. So budgets often have their own separate category for travel, both domestic and international, and those costs are separated out most times. When it comes to travel, there may be specific language in the RFP that puts constraints on whether or not you can travel internationally, and if you can, the places that you're allowed to go, especially if you're applying for a federal award. We are in the U.S. For those of us who are in the U.S., we do have constraints on where we can go, and that's going to be based on relationships between the governments. So be sure to read those carefully to see if you are able to travel internationally or whether you have to provide additional justification. Some reasons that you might have to travel internationally are if you're visiting a lab outside of the US where you're learning new techniques, you have a long-time collaborator, you want to spend a month, like that, or you're going to an international conference. All right. The other thing is the RFP may specifically say each PI or each proposal should budget for the annual PI meeting that will be held at such and such location for this grant. That has to show up in your budget. It's not an option. And when it comes to panel reviews, if you haven't budgeted for that meeting, it may raise a red flag. So be sure to include the prescribed travel requirements if they are written in the RFP in your budget. Subawards, all right. A subaward means that you are providing a portion of the funds that come to your institution to another institution. So the agreement will be between the prime, which is the person that or the institution that gets the award directly from the sponsor. So, and then the agreement is between the prime and the subawartee. Community partners can be subawardees. Anybody that has 501c3 status, perhaps, unless otherwise specified that you can't. And other universities can be subawardees. Indirect costs, we'll talk about that in just a second, are just general costs associated with facilities and administrative fees that everyone has to budget into their proposals unless otherwise stated. More on indirect costs. So if seasoned PIs are listening, you're cringing right now because we hate the indirect costs. It's, we're already trying to work within a pretty constrained budget. Costs are going up, student tuition is going up, and then indirect costs just eat into the budget. But whatever it takes to keep the lights on, we'll do it. So you may hear indirect cost called F&A, so which means facilities and administrative costs. Either way, it's still going to get applied. This rate is usually set by an agreement between the institution and the sponsor. So for instance, the indirect cost rate for UC Berkeley is 60.5, so 60.5%. I've heard indirect costs for National Lab going up to 75%. Don't quote me, but like research labs can have pretty high indirect costs. In the case where the sponsor sets the limit on indirect cost charges, that's the only time that the institutional rate is changed. So the California Air Resources Board has limits on indirect cost charges. Private foundations have limitations on indirect cost charges. Yeah. So when it comes to the budget, the actual charge for indirect costs is usually applied to a modified total direct cost, or MTDC. MTDC is the total direct charges, and we'll go through a budget example, minus the excluded charges. So what is excluded from total direct to create the modified total direct cost? Excluded are equipment and capital expenditures. So capital expenditures could be a fume hood that you're budgeting for, or equipment like, I don't know, a GCMS. So rental, lease, maintenance costs of off-campus space. So facilities fees are excluded from MTDC at specific institutions. Now, this is from one of my previous institutions, so check with your institution about what's excluded from MTDC. Tuition and fees for graduate students are not included in MTDC. Student health insurance is not charged, an overhead charge. Participant support costs are not charged, but the other supplies and expenses are. And the portion of the subaward that is in excess of $25K. So if you have a $30,000 subaward, only $5,000 of that subaward is subject to indirect cost charges. All right. So here we go. I'm going to take us through a really, really simple budget example. And what I am showing as an example here is the budget that is likely associated with a computational modeler that only needs personnel support and computational supplies. So say, for instance, you have a budget cap of $300,000 over 3 years. Well, once again, the easiest way to do this for beginners is to set your budget limit to be equal across each year. And so I'm giving an example of the first stab at a $100,000 per year budget. All right. So this is what it may look like. It won't be this plain, but it'll look something like this. And usually for those of you that have pre-award support, your pre-award coordinator will give you a template, or they'll just say, tell me what you need and I'll put it into the template. I've been known to be pretty hands-on with my budgets, and so I try to build a spreadsheet of my own, and then I'll send them my spreadsheet mock-up, and then they'll put it into the required template for the sponsor programs office to review. All right. So for this sample budget, I've included salaries, benefits, supplies, and indirect costs. So that's all you really need for a computational modeling project. Let's see. I have included 1 month of my salary at a rate of $9,000 a month. This isn't my salary. You can go look it up. It's public knowledge. And I'm budgeting for 50% of my time. So what this, and then that gives a total of $4,500 that I'm budgeting in year 1 for my effort. So I gather that in total, I'll be spending about 2 weeks total of effort dedicated to this project. Now, how that translates in research language, it may not actually correspond to 80 hours of work. It's probably going to be more than 80 hours. But this indicates that while this is an important project, I'm only budgeting half a month of time, because that's about how much effort that I think I'll be putting toward this grant, given the scope of this project. So it may not require super duper hands-on effort from me, but I think a half a month of effort is commensurate with what I'm proposing. Now, usually if you're a sole PI, you need to budget for 1 or more months, even 1.5 months, because that would be commensurate of a sole PI project. You may even budget for 2 months if this is a huge effort and it's a lot of your time spent. Also, if you know that you're only going to be targeting 1 or 2 major grants, go ahead and put 2 months on here. I've never seen it. It's usually 1 to 1.5, but you may check with your pre-award coordinator about how much time you should be allotting. Now, for projects with multiple PIs, sometimes everyone has to take half a month because of budget constraints. But in general, you want a budget for 1 month per year. Okay, and so right here, I've budgeted for 9 months of a graduate student researcher. All right. So the monthly rate is probably about $5,000. Hold your horses. But we usually only budget for 50% of their time. And this is due to labor uh, considerations. So a student can't be full time when they're enrolled in school. And so we usually put them at around 49.5%. That gives us a total of 22.5 for the 9 months per year that the student will be working on the project. Now, benefits rate. A faculty member such as myself may have a benefit rate of 16.4% versus, sorry, this should be 9 months right here. Sorry about that. So this total will actually propagate that typo in here. Just pretend like this is 9% or 9 months. So the monthly rate right here is 2.4%. So what I've done here is, considering that this is 9 months of benefit support, you can do the math here. But I've applied 16.4% to the 4,500 to calculate $738 for my benefit rate. All right. And so even though this says 12, I can confirm that this benefit amount is based on 9 months of salary for the grad student. So I've applied this 2.4% to the 22.5 to get 540. And so these are the benefits that'll be associated and charged to the grant. Now we've got tuition and health insurance. And so I've budgeted about $15,000 for health insurance and tuition for the graduate student. And this is a pretty hefty charge, and usually things like this get charged to an external grant. All right, and so that's the total personnel costs. Supplies. I've budgeted 2 computers at $2,500 each. All right, so this is supplies given that the unit cost is less than $5,000. This brings us to I have it as a total unit rate for consistency in the budget of $5,000. Okay. And you can actually explain in what's called a budget justification that the $5,000 corresponds to 2 computers. Now that I think about it, if I was reviewing this proposal, I'd want to see what these 2 computers are going to be used for. And pretty much I'd say it's my work computer and the GSR's work computer as a new PI. That gives us a total direct charge of $42,728, right? And that's adding the personnel and the supplies. Now, in this example, the indirect cost rate is 55%. That's only going to be applied to salary, benefit, and supplies. All right. So in this example, everything except tuition and health insurance is subject to the indirect cost charge. So I've added up 4,500, 22.5, 738, 540, 5,000 to calculate the amount that needs to be multiplied by 0.55, and that gives us 24,452 as the indirect cost charge for this project. Okay, so you'll multiply 0.55 by the sum of everything except tuition to get your indirect cost charge. Then you total all that up and we get 72,730. And that's the first stab at a computational research budget, a computational science research budget. And what we can see here is we have a lot more room here. So we can budget for travel. We can add travel into there. I may up my salary a month. And it's good for you to have embedded equations in this chart so that you can easily toggle between adding a little bit more funding here, taking a little bit of funding away here, so you can get to your target goal of $100,000 for 3 years, not a penny more. Okay. So that's the budget. And you really want to be thinking about this breakdown and what you need when you're writing your research plan. And I'll talk about that in the slide coming up. All right. So, some of the best practices that I have devised over time, in the first budget, this is something that I just talked about, creating a research plan in tandem with your budget. So, this takes a little bit of time to get used to, but essentially, I have that spreadsheet in mind when I'm thinking about exactly what I want to do for the research project. So you start out with a call for proposals that asks for you to develop new technology to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, like pilot scale, lab scale, bench scale stuff. So what you want to be thinking about with your budget is how much consumable am I going to need? How many people are going to be a part of the project? Do I need postdoctoral support? And start to put that into your spreadsheet there and see if that's even reasonable for the RFP. Are you allowed to support postdocs under this call for proposals? Some sponsors shy away from postdoctoral support. And so you want to make sure that your budget is commensurate with the RFP and with what you're planning to do for this research. The other thing that kind of gets overlooked is the alignment of the budget justification with the budget. So the budget justification is the narrative form of your budget, where you're specifically talking through or writing about the budget categories and what may be lost in the budget. So, for instance, I talked about the supplies line item where the details for those supplies won't fit into the spreadsheet or the budget template. That's when you go over to your Word document in narrative form and you say, all right, this is the breakdown of supplies and this is why I need what I'm budgeting for. You'll be surprised. Sometimes you'll forget and you'll put in the budget in your spreadsheet in the budget template that you're budgeting for 1 month. And then your budget justification will say half a month. And you want to make sure that those little things are consistent with each other because it will get flagged in the review. So somebody like me, I'm a numbers person. I love looking at the budget. I'm going to see right away if the justification does not match the budget. Okay. That's just, being careless. And I can't say that I'm 100% error free when I do it, but it's just little careless errors that you want to try to catch. Feasibility. All right. So I told you I'd talk about feasibility and things that I think about when I'm evaluating budgets. Too much salary. Okay. For PIs, are you budgeting for 5 months a year when your contract says that you can only budget for 3 months a year? You should not be over budgeting your salary in these grants. Let's see. Not enough graduate student support. All right. So if you have budgeted for half a year for graduate student support and the project activity table or the timeline, the Gantt chart has activities that span all 12 months, you need to indicate how the graduate student or what personnel is going to be supporting the rest of the 6 months of work if you're not budgeting for it in your proposal. Or who's doing that work? And if it's not the grad student, is it someone else in your lab that is supported by another project? You have to fill in those budget gaps. Because if I'm reviewing the proposal, I'm like, well, they've only budgeted for 6 months, but they've have 12 months of work in their Gantt chart. Where's the rest of the support coming from? Equipment available. Okay, so say your proposal calls for you to use the GCMS. There are sections of the proposal and documents specifically related to NSF called the Facilities, Equipment, and Other Resources document that give you the opportunity to say what equipment you have access to, whether through a shared lab, a shared equipment agreement that you'll need to specify, right? So if you're not budgeting to purchase the equipment that you're proposing to use in your research activities, you need to specify in your facilities document that, hey, I'm a part of this lab with access to that equipment, or I already have access to this equipment, right? Otherwise, your budget is not feasible and your research plan is not feasible because you haven't made it clear that you have access to what you need for the research activities. Travel to specified meetings. So I mentioned this before. If the RFP calls for you to travel to the annual workshop for all PIs and you don't have budget for that, you're going to want to specify in the budget justification. Well, if they've specifically said you need to budget for this, you need to budget for it. But in the case where there's not a requirement for a PI meeting, but say you have plans to travel to various conferences to disseminate your work, go ahead and indicate that while you will be disseminating your work at technical meetings, budget is not requested here. It will be supported elsewhere. Your pre-award coordinator may tell you to take that out, but me as a reviewer, I'd like to know that if you do have travel planned and you do plan on presenting your work at a conference, that you've thought about where that support is going to come from. The next thing is whether or not your activities align with your year-to-year spending. This is important, right? Say you've got a 3-year project that is heavily dependent on equipment that you're going to use, right? If I see that you've budgeted the equipment purchase to year 3, to me that your activities are not aligned with your spending. You need to put that equipment cost in year 1. Even though you know you're going to spend the money in year 1, just go ahead and make sure that the spending, it makes sense for your research timeline. The other thing is, if you plan on engaging with a postdoc on the grant for the entire project period, say 3 years, but you only have enough room in the budget to support them for half a year each year, you can put that in your budget, but in the justification, you need to say, the postdoc will be supported through other funds for the other half of their funding. So the one other thing, if you're doing community-facing research, participatory research, and you're giving out stipends, and the participatory activities occur in years 1 and 2, I would like to see that the stipend charges are associated with the year 1 and 2 budget. So this means that you're going to be thinking about research activities, the timeline, your Gantt chart, and your budget all at the same time. So if this isn't something you're comfortable with, you can work with your pre-award coordinator to strategize. You could be like, I have to spend and budget for $500,000 a year. This is what I need. And you can give them the itemized list of things you need, and they'll help you put that into the budget in, especially if they're familiar with research activities, in a smart way. All right. So if you have other questions about formulating your budget, optimizing timing, and categorization, please let me know. You can drop the comments in the chat. And I can follow up during another office hour about budgets. All righty. So that's the discussion about budgets. I hope that was informative. And I want to end office hour today by responding to a few of the questions that I thought were interesting, that correspond to what we're talking about today. So the first question is, how much do you budget on supplies, resources for each student project? And each time a student joins the group, do I buy them a desktop or a laptop? Okay, good question. I just talked about how to budget for supplies and resources. Now, so I talked about project allocation. Now I'm going to talk about per student allocation. The way that you budget per student is you want to think about how many students you can feasibly support in your lab. If you are thinking about managing a smaller group, meaning you want to have about 2 to 3 students per year or in total, then you can budget accordingly. If you're a first-time PI and you plan to only support 2 to 3 students total pre-tenure, then you can create your startup budget to reflect that. But say you plan on bringing on about 1 to 2 students per year, then you need to budget for computers in every external grant that you get. You can never underestimate the research infrastructure support that you'll need, especially if you plan to just let your group scale how it naturally will. So specifically, what I did is I used my startup funding to just buy the number of computer workstations, desktop workstations that would support what I thought was my maximum steady state of students. So I usually onboard about 1 student per year on average. And so that may be 2 students this year, 0 students for 2 years, and then 3 students, meaning 1 person should be graduating every year, or I will have graduated 5 students in 5 years. So I am comfortable with about 5 students at a time, 4 to 5. And so I need to make sure I have 4 to 5 workstations, desktop, and plus 2 or 3 more for interim people like undergraduates. I do like the undergraduates to have their own workstation when they come in. If it's a shared workstation where your interim folks can come in and use the same unit or desktop unit, that's okay too. So I say when it comes to supplies, like computational supplies, think about pre-plan for those purchases in your startup budget and go ahead and make that purchase in year 1. Your computers usually last about 5 to 7 years, a good computer. And I talk about tech in another office hour, so be sure to look at that. And then if you're scaling and you've run out of startup funding, you'll want to budget in those computers in your external grants. I hope that answers the question. When should hopeful academics start applying for faculty positions? Right now. Okay. So application season is upon us. The application opportunities generally get posted around August, September, October for the institutions that get ahead of the game, and they can be posted as late as January or February for institutions that are a little bit slower. If you are in your last year of grad school and you're going to defend in the spring, it's time to start looking, even if you're going to take a postdoc, because usually you can apply for a faculty position, interview in your last year, and then defer your start date for a year and a half, 2 years out while you finish your postdoc. So definitely all postdocs should be looking, regardless of how long you've been a postdoc, and people in their last year of grad school. That's just my blanket advice. So what should a BIPOC person do if they are being labeled as a diversity hire or told that the main reason they got their job is because they're a minority? Okay. Yeah, this is one of those questions. Traditionally, back like maybe 10, 20 years ago, affirmative action was pretty controversial and quotas were real. And in this case, I think I wasn't around during that time, but I would venture to say that when people were looking for diverse hires, that's truly all they were looking at was skin color, right? And they became lax on some of the qualifications, perhaps. for diverse candidates, which I think is a mistake. However, I will say that these nowadays, the language around hiring diverse candidates is both and, meaning not only do we value candidates with diverse perspectives, but we also want those candidates to be like top notch in their technical acumen and in their research field. And that combination exists. The problem arises when people think that they're mutually exclusive, and it's simply not true. So internalized racism about BIPOCs, that we're underperforming or we are pity hires, whatever, it's false. It is not mutually exclusive to be a candidate with a diverse background and lacking talent. It's just not true. Go ahead and look around at the faculty members that are bringing diverse perspectives to their fields, and they are performing extraordinarily well. All right. So how would you respond to that? Don't say anything. Let your CV speak for itself. Okay, the next question is, what constitutes co-authorship on a manuscript? Why do people disagree on authorship? Why do people care about being on an author list of, say, 10 or more? All right. I talked about authorship in my hidden research taxes episode, which I think is episode 7. Go take a look. So authorship, the order of authors is discipline specific. And when you're doing interdisciplinary work, sometimes there could be some disagreement about who goes where. And what constitutes a co-authorship should really be decided early on by those who are involved in the project. I've recently been told by a pretty prominent researcher at my institution that I hope to have on the show, that she has an MOU with her collaborators that specifically defines authorship guidelines before they even get started. So if they want to, complain later on, they can reference the MOU that they've already signed. Authorship is super important because it's the currency of academia. And so a lot of times what happens to BIPOC scholars or anybody with a marginalized identity is that their time spent helping to conceptualize, facilitate, and execute a project sometimes just doesn't get reflected in the authorship list. And I think that needs to be addressed. The other thing that I do when it comes to deciding authorship is I ask the following question. Would the output, with the paper, with the presentation, with the conference abstract be the same? Would it be the same product in the absence of that contributor? Meaning, did the person in question contribute something to this project that is unique and valuable enough such that if they weren't there, you would not have ever considered it? To me, that is a co-authorship. Okay, that is an intellectual contribution that in its absence, the product would be weaker. So don't erase people from their work. Don't erase people from your work. It's important to, and that's personally how I deal with authorship on manuscripts, because our time and our papers are our currency. Well, your time is valuable in academia and papers are currency. And if you're spending time helping to produce units that you get erased from, it's like you weren't even there and your time is wasted. And the last question I'll answer is, how do you pick the people you collaborate with? So this one's pretty easy. If we have shared research goals and we are close enough in discipline that we can speak the same language, I usually collaborate with folks like that. It's really just shared values. If we want to do the same thing, if we want to work on the same thing, we usually collaborate with each other. Mm-hmm. And if you're just focused on the task at hand, usually the other stuff just works itself out. All right. I am giving a bit of a vague answer there, and we can talk about collaborations in another office hour. All right. Thank you for those questions. I will end with a note about gratitude, right? So, one of the ways that I've been able to survive this long as an academic is to keep gratitude at the forefront of my daily mantra, etc. So, remembering what you are grateful for really helps you to get motivated and keep your motivation and being focused on what you're blessed with, regardless of your circumstances. So you could be feeling super disenfranchised and super tired, but just remember that you have secure housing. You are hopefully not food insecure. You know, for those of us of privilege in academia, we have stable jobs. And this is something to be grateful for. The fact that we can wake up and have a place to live and have something to eat and go to the ivory tower and conduct research is something to be grateful for. It is a privilege. So just remember to have gratitude to help you fight another day. And it helps you to put into perspective the ways in which you are supported and protected. So folks, be grateful for our privilege in academia, and I'll see you in the next office hour. Have a good weekend.